Hello everyone, my name is Josh Pugh and I will be covering Chapter 11 from the Catmull textbook titled The Unmade Future. I want to give a quick shout out and thank you for the presenters that have gone before me. Y'all have done such a great job and I hope to continue on that trend and finish strong. Next slide. This quote comes from the chapter and it says, "The best way to predict the future is to invent it." What I took away from this book, but specifically this chapter, is that these smart guys, specifically Alan Kay in this quote, they have a way of thinking that is very forward and very we can do this attitude. And I think there's a lot that we can take from that and on how to conquer the unmade future mentioned in this textbook. The best way to do it is invent it, and you find it along the way. Next slide. Creating vision. Now, how to conquer the unmade future, he starts off by creating a vision. He says visions occur over time, and that creativity is more like a marathon than a sprint. Oftentimes, people can't even articulate the visions that they have. They just know that once they see it, they'll know what it is. He also says it's hard to predict a future that doesn't exist yet, obviously, and you have to rely on guiding principles, intentions, and goals. And to create this unmade future, you have to foster optimal conditions where it can emerge and flourish. Obviously, you can't know what the future is, but if you create a situation in your business where ideas can flourish and you can find a way to get success in that project, that's the best way to find this future. It also says uncertainty can make us uncomfortable. A lot of us want to stick to what we know, but he says it's best to linger between the known and unknown, and this happens by developing a mental model, and I want to go into detail in this next slide. A mental model, I best describe it as a way of controlling doubt and pushing toward the unmade future. Fear is a lot of what he talks about in this chapter, and the best way to conquer this fear and the future of unknown is to push forward and fail along the way and learn stuff. And he has a few different analogies or metaphors that he describes as mental models to do this. Next slide. Mental models for creativity. He describes 6, but I've mentioned 5 here that were really key and that he really harped on. The first one is skiing. He doesn't want individuals to overthink, rather be comfortable and relaxed. This usually is when someone does their best work. The reason he says skiing is because sometimes newbies, when they go down a hill, they get really tight and scared, and they end up going faster and out of control and end up crashing worse than if they glided back and forth easily down the hill. And that's why he says this mental model helps him to conquer this unmade future, and it's by having the analogy of skiing. Next one is ship captain. How many times have you been in a project and people are just, debating on where to go next and nothing really gets done? He says that if you do that, you're just sitting in the middle of the ocean turning around and round and round. You need someone who can pick a direction and say, all right, we're going to go this way. And even if you don't find, exactly what you want at first, at least you're going in a direction. And by failing, you can often stumble along the solution that you were searching for, and you can direct the course to change that and be more successful the next time you go at it. He also talks about a mental model, a tunnel. Sometimes when we're halfway through a project, it can get dark and daunting, and you can't see your hand in front of your face, so you don't know, you kind of stop and hesitate. But he says to keep moving forward, and eventually you will be able to see the light at the end of the tunnel. He also describes a maze, which says that a lot of times when you're going through stuff, you need to remain calm so you can stop and assess the situation. I don't know if you've been through a maze before, but if you start freaking out, that's the worst thing that can happen because you don't know where you're at and you forget what things you've done. But if you assess the situation and stop and think critically, you can often conquer it. And the last one was an archaeological dig. And he describes it by saying that when they dig, oftentimes they uncover something and it reveals itself. So by finding, say, a part of the bone, they know where the next bone would be. So he's saying that when you're using this mental model and trying to be creative, a new idea, you need to visualize like you're an archaeological dig, uncovering different things along the way. Next slide. Mental models for management. Now this is different from the one before that talks about more directors and leaders type thing and creating something new. Now this talks about the management of once we know kind of where we're headed, what do you need to do, because there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of people in the departments. And the first mental model it describes for the management is a chameleon. Obviously, a chameleon can change its color depending on the environments he's in, and like that, you need to be able to be a different person for different people that you have in your business. Now, it doesn't mean you have to be fake and you can't be upfront with them, but you got to understand that you can't be and talk and use the same lingo and verbiage and style for each specific person. You have to be unique, and that's very important. The next one he describes as elevator. He says you can't dictate on high. You have to go to each elevator, each floor, to see how they see things. And he says it calls for something different, but once you get their view of the elevator, you can best see how to talk to them and manage them. The last one is a sheep herder. Now this is mentioned in the Bible, but he says as a sheep herder, for mental models for management, you have to know when to be in the front and lead, know to be in the middle and kind of get a feel of where everybody's at in the middle of the pack, where this train is kind of going, and in the back when you have to assist those struggling with a project and kind of getting nowhere, kind of you can prod them and assist them to get his or her task done. And I think that's very important in being a manager of a project or a manager of a business, just to keep all those moving parts. And he also says balance is so key in management. You have to be able to know that you can't be too chaotic and you can't be too tight and dictating. You have to have a good flow between chaos and not. Next slide, please. Closing thoughts on this chapter 11. We talked about mental models, and he says regardless of what mental model you choose, just know that whichever one you choose, make sure it gets the job done, whether it's a ski or an archaeological dig or an elevator or a chameleon. You got to know which mental model best fits you and best fits the situation. And this often evolves over time depending on the experience. So you have to know which one to use and which one best serves you and your business. Next talks about mindfulness. Now this part of the chapter was kind of weird for me. It talks about going to this retreat and just meditating for days, quiet, with a lot of people that are experienced meditators, kind of trippy. But what I took from is that you have to understand things change and make an effort to stay in the moment, get away from the project at times and think in silence. He said he went away to get away from all the chaos because it built up a lot of anxiety and depression in him. So he had to get away, and that's often what we have to do. Sometimes when you step back and look at the project farther away, you can get a better view of the whole landscape. It also says don't stick to the status quo in business, being willing to accept and adapt to change. Now that's kind of like the theme of this whole book. You have to be willing to find different ways. It's not one shoe fits all in business, especially communication. So you have to know when this happens and be able to accept that change is going to happen and find this change through conquering this unmade future and being creative. And lastly, the closing thought, these processes mentioned embolden us to navigate the unmade future by building frameworks to conquer whatever project is presented. Building frameworks. You got to, what I've learned most from this book, you got to learn how to think, how to be creative, how to visualize, how to do the things that these guys obviously have been so successful doing. And that's what it talked about in this chapter also. Next slide. Starting points. Now this is at the end of the book, and what it is, it's just thoughts for managing a creative culture. He does a good job at saying that not one catchphrase or life verse to live by is going to fit every business, but he does give a lot of his personal starting points, which are these just kind of catchy terms to where a business can start and be able to look at and go for in the future. And I picked out 5 out of the 33 that I most enjoyed And the first one was, failure isn't a necessary evil. In fact, it isn't evil at all. It is a necessary consequence of doing something new. We're going to fail, and that's just a fact of life, but it's just how you pick yourself up and how you can see what you did wrong and accomplish something new. 2, a company's communication structure should not mirror its organizational structure. Everybody should be able to talk to anybody. You don't want a communication where you only talk to the person directly above you and they have to talk over them, and it gets colluded through the line of communication, and your thought originally that could help the company was diluted, and you couldn't figure out what he was saying. The boss couldn't figure out what the problem was. Have a communication in a company where it's fluid and where anybody can talk to anybody. 3, excellence, quality, and good should be earned words attributed by others to us, not proclaimed by us about ourselves. Don't toot your own horn. That's the best meaning I got from that. 4, don't wait for things to be perfect before you share them with others. Show early and show often. It'll be pretty when we get there, but it won't be pretty along the way, and that's as it should be. Sometimes businesses fail because during meetings and critical thinking, we're afraid to step on eggshells. We're afraid to say the wrong thing because we'll be criticized, or it's against the majority of thinking process. Understand that, if you have a thought, express it, because often not, it leads to something that can be a success and that you can take and use in this project. Number 5, the first conclusions we draw from our successes and failure are typically wrong. Measuring the outcome without evaluating the process is deceiving. Don't go with your first inclination after failure. Okay, it was this, we'll go back. Check out the process and decide how best to move forward. And next slide. The last is my questions. The first one, what mental model analogy would you use to describe how you can conquer the unmade future? It can be one that you read from the chapter. It can be your own analogy or metaphor that you use. Just describe what mental model you would use. And number 2, from the list Catmull gives in his starting points, please select one not mentioned that you like. Why is it a good starting point? Now there's 33 to choose from. I chose 5 that I particularly enjoyed and I thought was relevant to our class, but pick one and describe and explain why you picked that and why you think it's important for a business to have that type of starting point. Thank you all so much for joining me in this presentation. I hope y'all got something out of it. I know I did reading the textbook, and I just want to encourage y'all to continue to strive forward and finish strong. Thanks, guys.